Chapter 4 Fortnite has just ended, and during it we've had 3 FNCSs and the biggest LAN since World Cup, the FNCS Global Championship. And a lot has happened throughout this year. So let's go through some of the top players to help determine who was the best player in Chapter 4. For our first person on this list, we have to mention the GOAT himself, Mero. This chapter was a huge roller coaster for him. He started off in Major 1 with a disappointing 22nd in the Grand Finals. And after that, he technically retired, even leaving his team Dignitas that he was signed to. However, just a few days after quote-unquote retiring, he came back and decided to play with an underrated player named Cooper. And in their first FNCS together, they got second, qualifying themselves into the FNCS Global Championship at the end of the year. Now in Major 2, he didn't have a super insane placement, getting 9th, but that was still really good. But the main reason he is put on this list is obviously the fact that out of nowhere he came out and ended up winning the Global Championship, earning himself a light $500,000. And officially making him tied with the most FNCS wins in the world. For our next player, I'm actually going to combine them since they've duoed together this entire year, and that's TaySon and Merstach. They started this season out strong, coming through with a win right off the bat, and this was actually their first season ever playing together as well. But they wouldn't stop there. In Season 2, they would end up pulling off a 2nd place, unfortunately getting beat out by Veno and Queasy, who went on to win 6 out of the 12 games in the finals. Sadly though, they would fall off pace throughout the rest of the season. In Season 3, they started to not really play the game that much and would actually end up getting into a little bit of a beef with each other. And because of that, they finished in 15th. But since they played so well before, they did have the global champs to look forward to. However, they would finish in 15th once again. But their dominance in the first 2 majors while on EU was extremely impressive and definitely makes them a top team. Another duo we can't not mention on this list has to be Kami and Setty. They've shown time and time again that they are one of the best, if not the best, in the world. They may not have as many FNCS wins as some other players, but their consistency speaks volumes. Now they didn't have the best start to this chapter with the first FNCS getting a 23rd, but that was because they were contested. But in the next 2 majors, when they weren't conned, they managed to get a 5th and 4th place. And going into the Global Championship, they desperately wanted that win, since the year prior, they won the FNCS Invitationals. But in the end, they weren't able to go back to back. However, they still managed to make a really good comeback in the final game, which resulted in them placing 2nd. So with them having an impressive record of 1st and 2nd at the global lands, it'll be interesting to see what they do in Chapter 5. Our next player on this list is someone you might not have heard of, and that's Pixie. Up until this chapter, he was relatively unknown. But when the solo victory cups were announced, he would start to put his name out there. He was one of only a few people that would consistently place every week. And in that first season's FNCS, he would end up playing insanely well, finishing in 5th place. But unfortunately, the other majors didn't go as well for him, getting a 21st in Season 2 and not even making the Grand Finals in Season 3. So at this point, he didn't place well enough to make it into the Global Champs. However, there was a last chance qualifier for it. But long story short, they would end up getting placed just 1 spot away from making it. But luckily for them, the 2nd place team went on to get disqualified, so their spot got rolled down to Pixie's team. And from there, they went on to play extremely well in the LAN's Grand Finals, even being in 2nd place throughout the majority of the tournament. However, in the end, they dropped down into 4th place. For this chapter, he went from only having a few $1,000s earned to now over 200,000. Let's now switch back over to NA with one of the most consistent duos, Acorn and Cold. In the first season before servers switched to NA Central, they came out strong, dominating the competition and winning. And in the next season's FNCS Major, they went on to place 6th. But after this, some drama would start to happen. Cold was not happy with the 6th place, and he wanted to split up with Acorn and instead play with an up-and-comer named Pollo, who had just placed 3rd. However, since Pollo just qualified to the Global Championship, his teammate didn't want to split up with him, and from there the drama would grow even more. But in the end, nothing would actually happen because it turned out that Cold and Acorn missed the date to let Epic know they were no longer a duo. So all that drama was literally for nothing. But after all that happened, the duo's vibes were pretty bad. Even with a shot mentality in Major 3, they still managed to get another 6th place, which isn't bad. But with the global championship coming up, nobody was really sure how well they'd do. But luckily, they were able to put their differences aside and place 7th, which was really good. And they even said that if it's duos next year, they'll continue to stick together. But sticking with duos who are consistent, we have to mention Rise and Yamzo. This team formed at the very beginning of the chapter, and since then have gone on to have an insane run. In FNCS Major 1, they popped off, getting 3rd place. In Major 2, a 4th, and in Major 3, another 3rd place. But the most insane part about all of this was that if some of their games went a little bit differently, they could have been the back-to-back-to-back FNCS champs. But obviously that didn't happen. And throughout that time, they weren't just placing consistently in FNCS, they were also winning nearly every single Cash Cup together. But just like Acorn and Cold, when the global championship came around, nobody really knew how they'd do since neither of them had played at a LAN before. But they would end up proving all the doubters wrong and play very well, ending in 8th place. Now, Yamzo and Rise were extremely consistent throughout the year, but this next duo, not so much. And that duo would be Queasy and Veno. In Major 1, they managed to get a solid 4th place, but it was in Major 2 where they made history. After easily making it to the Grand Finals, they went on to win 6 out of the 12 games in EU, with 5 of those 6 games being back-to-back. But even though they were able to take home the FNCS title that season, in Major 3, everything would go downhill. After deciding at the last minute to change their drop during FNCS, they would end up playing extremely poorly and eventually would miss out on making the Grand Finals, which was obviously a huge disappointment after seeing how dominant they were just that last season. But they still did make it to the FNCS Global Champs, however, we didn't see them at their best. After the year prior placing 2nd at the Invitationals, they were definitely the favorites to take home the trophy. But after all was said and done, they found themselves in 11th place. And it looks like after all of this, they will officially be splitting, ending the reign of one of Fortnite's greatest duos. But one duo that doesn't seem to be splitting anytime soon is Agers and Khanada. In the beginning of this chapter, they came out swinging with an impressive 2nd place in the first major. Sadly though, they weren't able to continue that momentum because in Major 2, they would end up getting contested the entire Grand Finals. But even though they were contested, they still managed to get 12th place, which again was extremely impressive. But it was in Season 3 where they would finally get that placement they had been striving for. After having an insane day 1, they found themselves in 1st place by almost 100 points. But things were looking grim on day 2 when they started playing horribly. However, even with an extremely bad day 2, they were still just barely able to hold on to the lead, and that ended up getting them their first FNCS win. And on top of doing really well in FNCS, during that same season, they were going absolutely crazy in every Cash Cup. Plus, a little fun fact, Khanada is one of the only players in the world to qualify for every single FNCS Grand Finals, but it was just recently where he would finally get that win. Now, unfortunately, their global championship run wasn't the best, and that's because they would end up once again getting contested. But this time, it was by one of EU's best duos, Malibuca and ThomasHD. But even going up against them, they still managed to end in 18th, which was very impressive. And speaking of Malibuca and ThomasHD, I can't not mention them on this list. This duo is known for the fact that neither of them have ever won an FNCS, despite also being known as some of the best players in the world. And like many people on this list, this was the first chapter they actually started playing together. And in Major 1, they ended up being so close to breaking that FNCS win curse. They ended up getting 2nd place, being just 1 point away from taking home that crown. But in Major 2, they would end up getting contested, so everybody pretty much thought they wouldn't do good. But it's ThomasHD and Malibuca, so obviously they ended up shocking everybody. And after being contested the entire tournament, they somehow managed to pull off a 3rd place. So in the 3rd season, when they found out they would be uncontested, everyone thought they were gonna win. But that wouldn't happen, and they'd actually get an 11th place. But again, it was time for the global champs, and like I mentioned before, they were contesting Khanada and Agers. So with already having a history of doing good while contested, everyone thought that would happen again. However, that wouldn't happen, and this time Agers and Khanada would end up on top, making Malibuca and ThomasHD finish in 39th. Our next player for this video is someone who ended up actually getting scammed by Epic Games, and that's Swizy. He's a Russian player who originally played on Asia servers and actually won an FNCS there, but in early Chapter 4 he moved to the west side of Russia, which meant he now had to play on EU servers. so nobody really knew if he would do well or not. But in Major 1, he did manage to get a 9th place in Grand Finals, a lot better than what people thought he would get. But in Major 2, he would end up taking a few steps back, ending in 26th. So because of this pretty poor performance, he decided to find another duo. And that's when he would end up playing with Putrick. And out of nowhere, this duo started popping off. And before anybody knew it, they ended up winning that season's FNCS Grand Finals by a landslide, officially making Swizy the second player ever to win an FNCS on multiple different regions. But soon after, disaster would strike. A while back, Epic made it so players who were Russian weren't able to receive prize money because of the war with Ukraine. And even though these players took the measures to make sure that didn't happen, they still ended up not getting paid the $200,000 they just won. And on top of that, they would end up getting disqualified from the global championship, which just poured salt into the wound. And nobody knows for sure, but if they were able to go, we probably would have seen them on the top of that leaderboard. Next up, we have our final player on this list, and he is who I personally would put down as the best player from Chapter 4. And that has to be Cooper. He went from pretty much a nobody at the start of the season to the world champ by the end of it. Just like Pixie, Cooper first started getting his name out there by consistently earning in most of the solo victory cups. But in the very first major, he actually wouldn't even qualify for the grand finals. But it would be in season 2 where his life would change forever. Since Mero decided to kinda quit the game, he wanted to try to play with some underrated player to see if he would help him improve. And that decision on who we would play with actually came down to a coin flip, which of course Cooper won. And from there, they would get 2nd place in FNCS, qualifying to the global champs, and then getting a 9th in Major 3. But nobody was ready for what was about to happen. Somehow, Cooper and Mero went absolutely crazy, dominating the competition. And because of their amazing performance, they would end up on top, winning the global championship. So in the beginning of this chapter, Cooper went from having under $10,000 earned to now having almost $600,000. So that's why for me, I think he is the best player. But at the end of the day, that's just my opinion. So comment down below who you think was the best player from Chapter 4, and who else you would add on this list that I didn't mention. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and I hope you guys all have an amazing rest of your days. Peace out.